Yeah,
Yeah,
Robert,
Robert,
welcome.
we can hear you loud and clear.
Yes, I'm sorry. I don't know why that didn't work originally, but anyway, thank you for inviting me, and now I trust you can hear me.
Yes, exactly. Thanks a lot for Robert
Yeah,
for
yeah,
accepting.
thanks for joining, Robert. Actually, there's some glitch going on with Twitter Spaces today. Some kind of update is about to come. So I will give a brief introduction. The topic that we are discussing today is rise of radical Islam in the world. And we have with us here Robert Bruce Spencer and a short intro about him. He is an American anti-Muslim author.
No, I am
And
not.
he...
Don't. That's not true. I am not anti-Muslim. You are reading from Wikipedia, and Wikipedia is a
Right.
hate site that is designed to try to discredit me. I must respectfully dispute that. I am not anti-Muslim. It is not anti-Muslim to oppose jihad violence and Sharia oppression of women
Absolutely.
any more than it is anti-German to oppose the Nazis. It is
Right.
simply a matter of being concerned for human rights. So I'm sorry for interrupting and for disputing your
No,
introduction,
that
but
is... Yeah.
Wikipedia is not a friend and not a reliable site, and I would strongly advise you not to use it.
Absolutely. My sincere apologies regarding that. So, like, as you can see, he writes a blog regarding Jihad Watch. So you might have all like listened him on Jaipur Dialogues as well. So he's a regular speaker there, and like we would like to welcome Robert Spencer here, and so you're most welcome.
Thank you. And so I understand that you want me to discuss what can be done about this threat and how it is rising today. That's
Absolutely.
correct? Yes. Okay.
Yeah,
Very good.
absolutely.
Right, Robert.
The biggest problem that we face today is the fact that the international left has allied with the forces of jihad violence and Sharia oppression. The reality is that the jihadis would never have been able to advance as far as they have in the modern world were it not for the aid and support of the left. In the West, in India, really everywhere in the world, this is true. At the beginning of the 20th century, the Ottoman Empire, the last caliphate, was abolished, and everywhere in the Islamic world, there was a tremendous influence of Western culture. And of course, most notoriously, Kemal Ataturk in Turkey actually went to war effectively against political Islam. He was ruthless and vicious and violent to the non-Muslims in Turkey, but at the same time, he stripped Islam of its political and supremacist and authoritarian aspects, and essentially defanged it. This was imitated by Reza Shah in Iran, and then by his son Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, and it was also imitated to a lesser degree in other areas of the Islamic world, even where there were not governments that were functionally anti-Islam. There was a tremendous cultural influence from the West, such that Nasser, the president of Egypt in the 1950s, is on video that you may have seen, laughing about the fact that the Muslim Brotherhood wanted all women to wear hijabs. And he said, "You try to get women to wear hijabs." And the audience laughs because the whole idea, as far as they're concerned, in the 1950s, the whole idea that women could be forced en masse to wear hijab was ridiculous. Nonetheless, by the 1970s or 80s, this began to change, such that now in 2021, it's very rare to see a woman walking outside in Egypt without the head covering, whereas in the time of Nasser, it was very rare to see a woman in Egypt walking outside with the head covering. Of course, the same thing happened in Iran with the Islamic Revolution of 1979, and to a lesser degree in Afghanistan, where even the most virulent jihadi state in the world today was more westernized. And there were some areas of Kabul and elsewhere where women were able to go out unveiled. But of course, that's long ago now. Uh, this all happened to a tremendous degree, not because the Islamic world regained strength since the abolition of the caliphate and grew in power, but because the left internationally saw it as a reliable ally and began to enable and encourage jihad activity. We see this in light of the increasing authoritarianism of the left. Of course, anytime there has been an extreme leftist regime anywhere in the world, it has been authoritarian. It has instituted itself by means of a reign of terror. Anytime, anywhere, the Soviet Union, the People's Republic of China, the democratic Kampuchea regime of Pol Pot in Cambodia, Vietnam, many, many others. Everywhere there has been a far left regime, there has been a reign of terror and violence directed against the native population. Now, this is a deep kinship. This reveals a deep kinship with Islam, because Islam also governs by means of a reign of terror. Sharia, Islamic law, is based on terror. The whole idea is that with the stonings and the amputations and everything else, the Muslim becomes so afraid, so terrified to break the law that he or she becomes compliant and obedient. And so they both rule by terror and violence, the left and Islam. And also, there is no democratic tradition in the Islamic world. There never has been. The only democratic country that has ever been in the Islamic world has been secular Turkey, which was, as I noted just a moment ago, actually a rejection of Islamic law, of political Islam. And of course, even now, secular Turkey is being re-Islamized by the President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. So the authoritarianism that the left favors also finds kinship in Islam, where there's a hadith that is attributed to Muhammad, in which Muhammad, the prophet of Islam, says that you should obey the ruler even if he is an Ethiopian with a head like a raisin. The racism is what is usually pointed out when people quote that hadith. But what is more important for the purposes of our discussion today is the fact that the prophet of Islam is saying you should obey any kind of ruler. You should be docile and obedient to the authority. And that, of course, is exactly the kind of attitude that the left wants to inculcate around the world as well. And so we have seen in our day a tremendous resurgence of Islamic jihad activity, plus this alliance with the left, which stigmatizes and demonizes any resistance or opposition to jihad violence as anti-Muslim, as I'm characterized in the Wikipedia bio, and as Islamophobic. It's all just a means by which people who oppose this authoritarianism are silenced. This is a significant difficulty, because while Islam was on the ropes and on the defensive everywhere at the beginning of the 20th century, now at the beginning of the 21st, it is aggressive and expanding everywhere. And this is because of authoritarian forces that are not Muslim, but see it as an ally and are using it to advance their own purposes and own agenda. Now, this might not work out all that well for the international left. For example, in the Islamic Republic of Iran, in 1979, the Tudeh party in Iran, which was the Communist Party, allied with Ayatollah Khomeini and was in favor of the establishment of the Islamic Republic. And then when Ayatollah Khomeini had consolidated his power, he put them all in prison. It is very possible that the alliance between the left and Islam in our own day will work out in the same way, that the leftists will end up regretting the fact that they made this alliance. Right now, however, Islam is essentially the favored religion of the international left, and this is true all over the world. And any resistance to it is being systematically silenced and rendered ineffective. The situation, consequently, is very difficult, but we can look to the past, to the reality of the fact that tyrannies have never been able to extinguish the human spirit, and they're unlikely to be able to do so now. And the more that they advance, as a matter of fact, the more people wake up to what is happening and begin to resist. So there is every call for us to persevere and every sign of hope at this point. Those are the opening remarks that I have. And if you have any questions or comments, we can continue the discussion in that way.
Well, Robert, thanks a lot. First of all, I'd like to thank you for joining on such short notice and also like explaining so beautifully. I had a follow-up thing around the term which is being used nowadays around the moderate Islam versus, when they try to garb everything out and say that, there is a concept of moderate Islam and it's not at all radical and people are not like trying to kill each other and all that, and try to sort of whitewash the entire scenario by saying these terms or like moderate Islam and all that. So do you feel that there is a constant sort of a image which is being portrayed which is not right?
Yes, there's actually a systematic campaign of deception, of misinformation and disinformation that is being carried out by the establishment media worldwide, because of course the establishment media is essentially not a news organization and not a series of news organizations anymore, but the propaganda arm for the far left. And consequently, they are always trying to whitewash Islam and the crimes done in its name and in accord with its teaching. In regard to moderate Islam, there is no such thing. When you study the Quran, when you study how Muslims have understood the Quran, how the mainstream Islamic authorities throughout history have interpreted the Quran, and when you look at the teachings of Islamic law and the teachings of Muhammad as described in the Hadith, there is no moderate Islam. There is no, in other words, form of Islam that does not teach warfare against unbelievers and the necessity to subjugate the unbelievers under the rule of Islamic law. Nor is there any moderate form of Islamic jurisprudence. All the madhhab, the schools of Islamic jurisprudence, teach this same thing, that Muslims have a collective responsibility to wage war against unbelievers and to subjugate them under the hegemony of Sharia. And the situation, however, this topic is clouded, is muddied by the fact that there are actually moderate Muslims. There's no moderate Islam, but there are moderate Muslims. But that is a concept that needs careful explanation. Many people think that there are moderate Muslims. The fact that there are moderate Muslims means that there are Muslims who actually, in principle, reject the idea of jihad warfare. Yeah, I think it would be very hard to find Muslims who reject the principle of jihad warfare. There are some famous moderates who have a great deal more power and influence among non-Muslims than they do among Muslims, such as Zuhdi Jasser, Rahil Raza, and others in the West. But otherwise, the moderate Muslims, generally, what they are people who have no intention of waging jihad. They are more interested in other things. Maybe they're not very religious, or they have other priorities and other points of view that are guiding their activities, such that they don't see it as something they're ever going to do. And that's all to the good. But they don't have a theological construct of Islam to support them. That is, they are never going to wage jihad, and that's fine, and we can be glad of that. But at the same time, there is no form of Islam that they can point to say that they follow that, and thus they are moderates. And so they are always vulnerable to criticism from jihadis and supporters of jihad, who can say that they are not true Muslims or not fully living out their faith because they reject jihad violence. And this is the way that jihad recruiters actually make recruits among peaceful Muslims, by telling them this is a responsibility in Islam that you are ignoring, and you have to stop ignoring it.
Thank you so much, Robert. Janice, I think you had a question.
Yeah, Mr. Robert. Yeah, so even the term jihad, I mean, they keep going round and round. They say it is a fight within to clear the inner evil. So if they really had to clear inner evils, they would have reformed their society, removed the Sharia. They would have probably given rights to women. That is the inner cleansing. So should we take it that Taliban, ISIS, these guys are more closer to the original Islam? What are your views, sir?
Yes, absolutely they are. The whole idea of jihad as an interior spiritual struggle is just more deception that is designed to confuse non-Muslims. It is true, jihad means struggle, and that there are all kinds of struggles in Arabic and in Islamic theology, just like there are all kinds of struggles in English. And so the Islamic Republic of Iran has a Department of Agricultural Jihad. This doesn't involve any kind of violence or warfare. It just means that they're struggling to increase the efficiency of their farms. And that's all to the good. At the same time, however, the primary meaning of jihad in Islamic theology is warfare against unbelievers. And that is true across all of the different sects, all of the different schools of jurisprudence, all of the different groupings of Muslims. It is always primarily the meaning of jihad, that one wages war against unbelievers in order to subjugate them under the rule of Islamic law. As a result, the idea that jihad is an interior spiritual struggle, while it may be true, it is only true in a limited sense, and it certainly does not preclude the reality of jihad violence. There are different kinds of jihad. So there is the jihad of the pen, the jihad of the tongue, and also the jihad of the sword, and various others. The mistake that Westerners make and that non-Muslims in general make, and this is a mistake that is aided and abetted by these agents of disinformation, is to think that because there is spiritual jihad, there is therefore not violent jihad. And so, for example, you hear people invoking the Sufis a great deal in this connection and saying, you see, the Sufis are very spiritual and they are only interested in jihad as a struggle to unite with Allah. And that is only partially true. The Sufis are indeed spiritual, much more spiritually minded than other sects of Islam. At the same time, the Sufis have never rejected jihad violence. And they actually led the jihad against the Russians in Chechnya throughout the 18th century and 19th century until the Wahhabis started to come in. And the Muslim Brotherhood was also very influenced by the Sufis. And Hassan al-Banna, the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, prescribed Sufi spiritual exercises for the early brothers. Meanwhile, the Brotherhood was dedicated to waging jihad in order to establish Sharia all over the world and restore the caliphate. So this is just another great deception that jihad is just a spiritual struggle.
Yeah, thank you. Another question, Dr. Robert, is there is another distinction which is being made that, Shias are peaceful, Sunnis are more violent. But when we see, let's say, case of Israel, you will see Hamas, which is largely Sunni, and Hezbollah, which is largely Shia. They are united in that axis, whereas in rest of the places, you will see them fighting each other. So what are your views on that?
There's an old Arabic expression that translates to my brother against my brother, but both of us against our cousin. Sunnis and Shia do hate each other indeed, but they never hesitate to unite to fight against infidels. And so the Islamic Republic of Iran, which is Shiite, has no problem funding Hamas, which is Sunni, as you noted, as well as Hezbollah, which is Shiite and the Iranian client, in order to fight against Israel. It is completely false to say that the Shiites are violent or peaceful and the Sunnis are violent, or vice versa. There is a long tradition of jihad violence among both Sunnis and Shiites. And anybody who examines the history of jihad, you can read my book, The History of Jihad, or study other sources, and you'll see that Sunnis and Shia, there's absolutely no distinction in terms of their understanding of jihad as warfare against unbelievers.
Yeah, so another follow-up question is, so in current context, if we see, today they have allied with left, and they have like organizations like Council on American Islamic Relations, and then you have senators like Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib and so on and so forth. So how important, and those of us who have been educated by likes of you and other scholars, how important is this awareness of true Islam for a mass, not uprising exactly, but counter of this entire narrative?
I'm not sure I understand the question. How important is this understanding of real Islam for the countering of the leftist narrative?
Left Islamist, the entire alliance, correct?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch that.
Correct. Their narrative, that which they are spinning this narrative of Islamophobia against our voices.
Yes.
So how to counter that?
Well, Islamophobia, of course, is a word nobody had heard of up until about 20 years ago. It was devised in the 90s by a Muslim Brotherhood organization, the International Institute of Islamic Thought, precisely in order to intimidate people and to inhibit criticism of Islam and resistance to jihad violence. They took the cue from the gay lobbies, the homosexuals, because they had claimed that the critics of their movement were homophobic and were just hated homosexuals, and that was what was motivating them. And so the Islamic groups saw, oh, that's a good idea, that works very well, and have adopted it with the whole concept of Islamophobia. When you're talking about Islamophobia, you've already departed from rational consideration, however, because people speak about Islamophobia, they mean two separate things that actually have no business being together. The whole idea of Islamophobia is to conflate two distinct phenomena. One is the attacks by vigilantes against innocent Muslims, which are never justified anywhere, under any circumstances. But also the word is used for the criticism of Islam and resistance to jihad violence. They're both Islamophobia. And the reason for that is because the people who use the word want to silence all of the criticism and resistance to jihad by claiming that it leads to attacks on innocent Muslims. This is false, and the best way to counter it is to note that the statistics on hate crimes that are published all over the world show that there is a great deal more anti-Semitism and hatred of Jews and hatred of other groups than there is of Muslims. And hate crime statistics do not bear out the claim that Muslims are subjected to wholesale discrimination and harassment anywhere in the world. And so, as with so many things, there is simply a huge disconnect between propaganda and reality. And so we have to continue to insist on the facts as much as we are able. And that counters the propaganda very effectively.
Thank you so much, Robert. Baba, yeah, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, one of the question, Robert, most of the time we face is that in a free liberal democratic society, because a liberal free democratic society always treat Islam only as a religion, and hence it allows it to practice, profess, and even propagate their religion, and hence most of the time it fails to counter that. So how do you see this scenario? It's a very catch-22 scenario where the democracy itself allow every religion to profess and practice their religion and propagate. However, there are some ideologies which are inbuilt into the Islamic doctrine, which itself will later on went on to subvert the right to profess and practice other faiths.
You're quite right. There is a great difficulty that liberal democracies face that they have not admitted that they face, but eventually they're going to have to face because it's going to be unavoidable. And that is the impossibility of a tolerant society tolerating a radically intolerant belief system. The liberal societies have generally assumed and enforced the assumption that Islam is completely compatible with secular liberal democracy, and that there's no difficulty whatsoever for Sharia adherent Muslims fitting into secular liberal democratic cultures. This, however, is repeatedly being proven false and is false on the basis of a simple examination of Islamic law in light of the fact that Islamic law denies the freedom of speech and denies the freedom of conscience and denies the equality of rights of women and so many other things that secular liberal democracies take for granted. And so the more that these secular liberal democracies bring in Muslims, the more they are going to face this contradiction because it's going to be unavoidable. They're going to have Muslims violating the principles and mores of their societies, and they're going to be increasingly finding it difficult they're going to find it increasingly difficult to be able to maintain the idea that there's no conflict between Islam and secular liberal democracy. We saw this recently in the United States when several of the Afghan refugees, having newly arrived in the country, were arrested for spousal abuse, for sexual abuse of a minor, and for rape. And what's noteworthy is that none of the news reports, and I'm sure none of the authorities are involved have any idea, but none of the news reports noted that it's very likely, as a matter of fact, it's virtually certain that none of these Afghans who were arrested had any idea they were doing anything wrong, because they were just behaving the way that they behaved in Afghanistan. And it's okay for them to to hit their wives in Afghanistan because that's allowed in the Quran. And the idea of sexual abuse of a minor is not something that is a problem in Islam, because Muhammad was 54 when he consummated his marriage with Aisha, who was 9. And so they didn't know they were doing anything wrong. And they end up in America, they end up getting prosecuted. Now, it's good that they were prosecuted, but more and more American authorities and non-Muslim authorities all around the world are going to start to realize that the behavior that they have been prosecuting is not actually an aberration, but is mainstream Islam based on mainstream Islamic doctrine. And then we'll see. I have no idea what will happen at that point. It may be that the rot in secular liberal societies will have been so far advanced by that time that they'll simply surrender. That does seem to be the way it's going now, but one never knows how things will work out in the future.
Thank you so much, Robert. Samar, you had something you wanted to ask?
Yeah, actually, my question was related to the caliphate thing. As like we have that IS also believed that it considered itself as a like caliphate. Also, like regarding the Muslim Brotherhood, it also tried to establish itself as a caliphate since 1928. But like nobody could be established as a caliphate. So the basic question of mine is: does this ideology of trying to establish a caliphate is the basis of jihad? That's why these people are involved in jihad. Do you consider it?
Yes, that's right. That's actually one reason. It's not the only reason. Because even were the caliphate to be established, and you're quite right, the desire to reestablish the caliphate is universal among Islamic groups. I think you'd be very hard-pressed to find an Islamic group that, if they were answering honestly, would say that they're not interested in restoring the caliphate. The caliphate is a basic Islamic doctrine, and the abolition of the caliphate in 1924 is something that has inspired rage among Muslims around the world and led to the establishment of the Muslim Brotherhood and then of Al-Qaeda and ISIS and other groups. And they all want to establish the caliphate. But even if the caliphate were restored, even if we were to see in our lifetimes the restoration of a caliphate that was actually accepted by large numbers of Muslims, I say that because, of course, ISIS also said that it was the caliphate and declared a caliphate when it controlled territory in Iraq and Syria. But most Muslims around the world did not accept that. And if, however, a caliphate were established that was accepted by a large number of Muslims, jihad would not then cease. As a matter of fact, it would increase, because in Islamic law, Sunni Islamic law, the caliph is the only one who's authorized to wage offensive jihad. All jihad without a caliph is defensive. Now, sometimes Muslims engage in quite a bit of mental gymnastics in order to justify the idea that their jihads are defensive. But when you see Muslims listing off grievances that the non-Muslims have done all these terrible things, that the Indian government has passed the Citizenship Act, that various other terrible things, supposedly terrible things, have happened, adjusted the status of Jammu and Kashmir, all kinds of terrible things, that these are grievances that Muslims must fight against. The whole idea is that they are justifying defensive jihad. They are explaining why it is incumbent upon Muslims to fight, because the Islamic Ummah, the community worldwide, has been attacked. Now, when there is a caliphate, however, they don't have to list grievances. They don't have to show how it is important for Muslims to fight back in defense, because the caliph can wage offensive jihad. As a matter of fact, he has the obligation to wage offensive jihad. He has to declare jihad against a non-Muslim state on a regular basis and continue a state of war against non-Muslims. So that is one of the main reasons why Muslims want to restore caliphate, is that it would justify a far greater scope for the jihad against non-Muslim states.
Yeah, thank you, Robert, for answering my query. I was having a serious query regarding it. Yeah, Dharma, please continue.
Yeah, so I think we have Shailendra-ji, Gyan-ji, and Utkarsh-ji. Anybody would like to ask anything to Robert? I think.
Yeah, and one request, keep your questions short and crisp.
First of all, namaskar. My question is, we have identified different type of jihad, different type of radical Islam, political Islam, and all their propaganda, all their agenda. But if we go to the core solution, what is the core solution to get rid of this mental illness?
There's no real solution. I know everybody wants a solution. That's perfectly understandable. But we have to understand that as long as there are people who believe that the Quran is a book from Allah and that Muhammad is a prophet, then there will be jihad. And so what we have to do many things. What is, if we have liberal secular societies, then we have to make it clear, we have to press our politicians to make it clear that jihad activity and Sharia adherence is not to be tolerated and should not be tolerated in the societies, that everybody should be subject to the same laws, and that freedom of religion is not a license to violate other laws or to try to destroy the society altogether and establish a caliphate. And so that's one thing. The other thing is that there needs to be an alliance internationally between states that are faced by jihad. And this is something, it's a shame that this should have been done right after 9/11 or even before that. The United States government is absolutely ridiculous in this regard. After 9/11, of course, I'm sure as you all know, George W. Bush met with Parvez Musharraf of Pakistan, and the United States started giving Pakistan over $1 billion every year in order to fight Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. It soon became clear that the Pakistani government was giving a large portion of this money to Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. And instead of ending the arrangement with Pakistan and recognizing that it was a sham alliance, the United States government actually increased aid to Pakistan. Now, this is just appallingly stupid and self-defeating. If the United States were serious about fighting jihad, resisting jihad violence and the expansion of Sharia, then there would be no alliance with Pakistan, and a much stronger alliance with India and with other states that are faced by the same jihad violence. But because the United States government has never even acknowledged that there is a jihad, and remember that 6 days after the 9/11 attacks, George W. Bush went into a mosque standing in front of several people who were connected with jihad activity and said that Islam was peace. And the response to the jihad activity has been deformed in the United States ever since. So there's no real solution, but if the states of the world that are not Islamic and want to resist the jihad were to ally, a great deal could be accomplished. Unfortunately, this is not on the horizon.
Thanks, Robert. So in terms, you're saying that it was actually propagating and sending money to the enemy who was actually handing it over to the Al-Qaeda.
That's
was
right.
like,
That was
yeah.
documented in 2008, and yet nothing was done. As a matter of fact, the money to Pakistan from the United States was actually increased, as if somehow this would bring them over to our side. The short-sightedness and willful ignorance on the part of American authorities cannot possibly be overstated.
Okay. I think,
Okay.
yes.
Yeah.
Uh,
Next question, Dr. Dhanashri wants to ask a question. Shailen sir, we will return back to you. Just a moment.
Yeah, thank you, Sama. Thank you, Robert, sir, for coming here. And it is always a privilege to hear from you. My question, sir, is what is the a threat of the Muslim people, Muslim citizens coming to our country, especially the Western world, and when they grew in the number, they demand for the Sharia law. So, how big is this threat? Is there, and what is the solution for this?
Well,
Thank you.
it's very big, and it's happening because, to a tremendous degree, the Muslims are carrying out are trying to lay hold of the promise that is in the Quran in chapter 4, verse 100, where it says, "Whoever emigrates for the sake of Allah will have a reward that is obligatory from Allah." And so if you forsake your home and become a refugee for Allah and His Messenger, this is what the Quran says, then you will receive a reward. But the idea is not just that you leave your home in order to find a better job. You leave your home to go to a non-Muslim state in order to Islamize it, in order to bring Islam to it. That's what brings the reward from Allah. And so, unfortunately, immigration into the West has been cast by the Pope and by others as being some kind of a moral obligation. And this is completely baseless. And it has it proceeded without any consideration for the possibility of jihad violence on the part of the newcomers, or of the likelihood of societal and cultural disruption on the part of the newcomers. And so the only thing we can do in this regard is try to once again tell the truth and point to unwelcome truths and truths that are denied and concealed by the establishment media in regard to the beliefs in jihad and Sharia on the part of the nations from which the migrants are coming, and the likelihood that they will cause great disruption in their new countries.
Thanks so much, Robert. I think
I wanted to ask you about the this hegemonization of Chinese, especially in these third world countries, which are mostly Islamic countries. From the very inception of Islam, it has been a politico-theocratic philosophy. Let's not say it a philosophy, but a cult. So, after the collapse of Soviet Union and Cold War, what has happened is that Islam has emerged as a threat to the civilized nations of the world, and China is heading that. So, how do you see the interference of China in these third world countries, and especially Pakistan, Afghanistan, this South Asian region?
China is trying to establish itself as the world's superpower and supplant the United States, and is trying to make economic alliances with Afghanistan, Pakistan, and others in order to accomplish this. The Chinese have no trouble allying with whoever will help them. They're also working extensively in Africa in the same way. The Muslims, at the same time, understand that China is not like the United States. The United States is societally and culturally weak right now, and they saw that weakness, and so they stood up to the United States, whereas they see China as strong. And Islamic law mandates that you do not wage jihad against an enemy that you have no chance of defeating. And you don't wage jihad against an enemy who has more than twice your strength. Consequently, they don't fight against China. And as a matter of fact, the Taliban in Afghanistan actually recently assured the Chinese, when they took power in Afghanistan, that they would not aid the Uyghurs. and that if Uyghurs crossed into Afghanistan from China, they would not allow them to be able to do their planning in Afghanistan. And this is all because they respect strength. And so they see China as strong. Eventually, just as in every other situation in the world, it's going to come down to a conflict between the two. And there will be, it will be interesting to see whether it is Islam or the communists that prevail. In Iran, the Muslims were able to prevail over the communists. With China, it may well end up being the same thing, but that's going to be quite a while from now.
Thanks a lot, Robert. Yeah, in terms of the Uyghur Muslims, we never hear from anyone. And when it was asked, the question was asked to Imran Khan, he said, what, who? He didn't even know about that. So, yeah, I think we have Utkarshji with us. Utkarshji, you want to ask something?
Yeah. Good evening, Robert. First of all,
Hello.
I've read both your. I have read your book, the history of jihad, and I'm waiting for that book, the Critical Quran. First of all, in that history of jihad, you have mentioned 1400 years of proselytizing military campaigns throughout the Middle East, North Africa, northward into the Iberian Peninsula and France, and later eastward, and eventually subjugating Persia and India. You have also written extensively about how few Westerners are aware of the ongoing India-Pakistan Kashmir dispute that has actually its genesis in the two-nation theory, which is actually a supremacist thought, as you have mentioned in the book, that led many Muslims to demand Islamic Republic of Pakistan be separated from India in 1947. So I would like to know, first of all, how many people in the Western world are actually aware of the fact that Hindus were actually pushed out from their own state of Kashmir by radical Islamists, and how many of Westerners are actually aware of the kind of radical Islamic terrorism Pakistan has been carrying out in India for last 3 decades, in which hundreds of thousands of Indian civilians and security forces people have been killed. Is there any awareness in the Western world, or the kind of awareness or the kind of propaganda that is being regularly spread against India and that is being regularly propagated against India in Western world, especially on the issue of J&K, on the issue of Jammu and Kashmir? So I would like to know that from you.
I'm sorry to say that the situation is not positive. There are very few people in the United States, very few people in the West who are aware of all this. And that's actually one of the reasons why I wrote The History of Jihad, was in order to try to awaken people in the United States and English-speaking people everywhere to the reality of the jihad worldwide, that it wasn't just something that hit us on 9/11 and that has been in the Middle East and Afghanistan, but all over the world, and that India was probably the country most victimized by jihad activity over the centuries. This is not something most Westerners are aware of, and they're not aware of Pakistan as the rogue jihadi state that it is. I think it's especially a terrible scandal that the complicity of the Pakistani government in aiding the Taliban is not known, and not even apparently a matter of interest to the United States State Department and to the foreign policy establishment, which seems to be just fine with continuing to shower money on Pakistan, despite the abundant evidence of its involvement in jihad activity in the Mumbai massacre and in so many other contexts. So we have to just keep trying to sound the alarm and speaking about these issues, but we have to understand that the establishment media is simply not interested in making these things known.
Thanks so much, Robert. I think, Janice, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask a follow-up question. As we have seen, besides playing upon our psyche, they use this method of show of strength by reading their prayers on road, etc. Also, when I look at their claim on Jerusalem, when I see Christians and the Jewish claim on Jerusalem, that feels very correct. But when this their aggressive claim over Jerusalem also sometimes looks like a show of strength. What are your views on, sir?
Well, sure, absolutely. That's very true. In Jerusalem, there is no real right that Muslims have to the land. It is clearly the city of the Jewish people from time immemorial. At the time of the Muslim conquest, the Muslims built the Dome of the Rock on the Temple Mount in order to signify the victory and superiority of Islam over Judaism and Christianity. And they have constructed this hadith which claims that Muhammad made a night journey from Medina to, oh, actually, no, it was from Mecca to Jerusalem, and ascended into paradise there and met Allah and so on. This is just a fable, a legend. It has no historical reality. And so the Islamic claim to Jerusalem, which is based on it, also has no historical reality. But the whole idea in these shows of strength, like you noted, the prayers in the streets and so on, is to declare their presence and a certain superiority that is also signified by the sort of thing like by actions such as the construction of the Dome of the Rock. The idea is to show that the Muslims are present, that they're not going away, and that they are asserting that they are not bound by the laws and conventions of the host culture. So while other people would be arrested for praying in the street, Muslims defy the laws and pray in the street. And indeed, the authorities are afraid to appear Islamophobic and arrest them. And so it's the same kind of declaration of victory and superiority.
I actually have read that book of yours, The Palestinian Delusion, and it covers the entire thing very well. I would also request you somewhere to come up with a book on Kashmir if you can, because you have written extensively about it.
That's a good idea. Thank you. I'll see if I can do it.
But I just would want to draw your attention to this, the difference. In Palestine, if you see the population of Jews, and they have some dominance over their land, which they are trying to oppose them there. In Kashmir, Hindus that were driven out were already in minority. They were not even 2-3. They were just 2 to 3% there, and they were driven out because of this demographic change. Next, Tamoharini, you can go with your question next.
Tamoharini, are you able to hear?
Yes. Yeah. Thank you, Janasya.
Yeah, please.
Good evening, Robert. I just have one basic. Yeah, hello. I just have one basic question, and my question is, why is every Islam follower's judgment clouded? Like, it's irrespective of they are literate or illiterate. Usually, it's with the one who has the highest degrees. Like, let us set aside social media influencers or politicians because they are inclined to whatever they have to do or said to do so. But it's the same with almost every common Muslim. But suddenly this judgment or righteousness can be seen in them when they are in the shoes of victims. Why does this happen? Can you please answer this?
What exactly happened? That the Muslims have a perspective that is so different from that of non-Muslims, or what exactly? I'm not quite sure I understand.
Yes, it's like, why is their judgment so deluded? They cannot differentiate the right from the wrong when it comes to
yes.
And when it comes to a non-believer, they know like that is wrong and this is right. Why does that happen?
If you were to be raised in an Islamic context, then you will be inculcated with values that are very different from those that other people are raised with. And so the Quran, for example, says Muhammad is the apostle of Allah. Those who follow him are ruthless to unbelievers, merciful to one another. That's chapter 48, verse 29. Now imagine if you thought that was the perfect word of the creator of the universe. And so you thought that it was good and righteous to be ruthless to people who were not in the fold. And you would not have any greater, I mean, you have the innate moral sense that every human being has, but then it gets deformed by this scripture that tells you that it is perfectly good and right to be terrible, to treat these people horribly because they're rebels against Allah. And they're the most vile of created beings. This chapter 98, verse 6 of the Quran. And so it's because the Quran teaches this hatred and contempt for unbelievers that Muslims behave in this way, with hatred and contempt for unbelievers, and believe that they're being righteous when they do so.
Yes, thank you. I totally agree on that part. But when it comes to shaping of a character, 80% of the time they are with their people, and 20% of the times they are with the non-believers as well. Take us like maybe Hindus, Christians, or whatsoever. Why does that not influence on them?
Well, it does some. Clearly, there are some people who become influenced by the non-Muslims and change their attitudes. But they're always a minority because the non-Muslims are so negatively depicted in the Quran and in Islamic tradition that most of the time when a Muslim has a lot of contact with non-Muslims, he may be friendly with them, he may have no problem interacting with them, but he's still going to have a contempt for them in a certain distance. I can tell you, for example, there was an American colonel who worked with an Iraqi colonel when the United States forces were in Iraq. And they worked closely together. The American colonel was training the Iraqi colonel in various military things. And finally, the American colonel was called back to the United States, and he was saying goodbye. And the Iraqi colonel, with whom he had been quite friendly, said, I've enjoyed working with you, and I consider you a good friend, and I'm going to be very sorry when it comes the time that I have to kill you. And this comes from the teachings of Islam, that he believes that however friendly he may be to these people, they're still unbelievers, they're still vile, they still have to be warred against. And so he can be friendly with them on a limited basis, but ultimately the principles of Islam will win out.
Thank you so much, Robert. I think we have Awaken with us.
India.
Awaken.
Yeah, I can. I have to take one more, and then I have to go, I'm afraid.
Yeah, sure.
Yes.
Good evening, Robert. Namaste to the audience. Thanks, Robert, for enlightening us with your perspective on Islam. The question that I have primarily is, why has left liberalism or communist or the far left always aligned, and you mentioned that in the course of this discourse, with the radical Islamist? Now, it's a sort of a very curious one, because the left is traditionally perceived to be liberal and change oriented, whereas Islam in its conventional sense is anti-change, quite orthodox, etc. So what do you two questions here, where in your analysis and your books, where do you see the origin of this alignment, and why does it perpetuate still? Because as ideologies, they are very opposite to each other, but they still go on. What do you think are the reasons for this?
They're actually far closer than we usually realize. And as I noted at the beginning, this is because they're both authoritarian. Both the left and Islam has a vision of a perfect society. Sharia, if it were fully implemented as far as Muslims are concerned, would be the perfect society on earth. And of course, the far left, is working for the dictatorship of the proletariat that would be the perfect society on earth. And both are enforced by a reign of terror, as I explained earlier. Both are a utopia that is established by terrorizing those who dissent. And so I think they have a very deep ideological kinship on the basis of that shared authoritarianism. And on that, I'm sorry I have to run off, but I have another engagement, and I thank you very much. Sure. It's delightful talking with you all, and have a marvelous evening.
Robert, we'd like to thank you from the bottom of our heart. Thank you for joining on such short notice, and we look forward to hearing from you again and again. And I'd like to also thank the audience here who has been so patiently listening to everyone here as well. We try to come up with these sort of topics and ideas in most of our spaces we have seen. So we try to cover some socio-political angle as well. This was one of the other attempts which we had in terms of the dismantling global Hindu Mesia project, which we were actively working on. And this was one of the part of the series of that dismantling global Hindu Mesia project as well. And I really want to thank each and every one of you, Samar, Shalu, all the speakers, everyone who chimed in today. Samar, do you want to say something?
No, you please continue. I'm a bit engrossed, please.
Okay. So, Janasya bhai, some comments from your side?
I just thought that Dr. Dheeraj has not spoken and Kumud sir. So Bawali is here, and we have been speaking on this topic time and again, and we have had previous speakers also. So if they wish to contribute or ask, I mean, we are all equals. Whatever, we can hear them also.
Yeah, I mean, we can still continue the discussion. If you guys have anything, we can discuss amongst ourselves. Kumud ji is, I think, raising his hand, and Dr. Dheeraj is also with us. Kumud ji, yeah, go ahead, and then we'll talk.